Well, in our last lecture, we had a chance to briefly look at some of Plato's life, and then we also dug into his big idea, his theory of the forms, where Plato divides the world into two parts. And so the main part for Plato is the realm of the forms. This is this immaterial world, it's a conceptual world where there are ideas like, say, a triangle. So in the realm of the forms, we all have the idea in our mind, because it exists in the forms, of what a perfect triangle is. And so that exists in the realm of the forms, but you also have the particulars for Plato, which is the physical world that we see around us. And in the particular world, we can see examples of the forms. So if we're thinking about, say, a triangle, you could write on a piece of paper a picture of a triangle. Now, when you write the picture of the triangle, for Plato, you're not really drawing a perfect triangle. You're drawing an imperfect representation of a triangle. In other words, you're drawing a particular triangle, and particular triangles exist all over in the world of experience that we can see, but all of those particulars are imperfect. And the only perfect triangle exists in the realm of the forms, and so he divides the world then into those two parts, the forms and the particulars. Well, Plato has another understanding of dualism that exists in the human person. So if the world is divided between the forms and the particulars, the human person is divided between the soul and the body. So the soul, for Plato, or we could also call it a mind, but the soul is this immaterial realm in the human person for Plato, where you can think about things. You can access ideas. It's well, as we'll see, that soul is divided into three parts for Plato, but it's this immaterial world, and actually, it's through the soul that you get access to the forms. You also have a physical body, and that's where your senses are located. And you use your body to access the particulars. So you see a particular triangle while you're using your sight, which is part of your body, to see the triangle. And so that's the relationship between the dualism that exists in the human person with the dualism that exists in the world around us. Now, Plato has an interesting argument for the existence of a soul that you can find in his work called the Meno, or Meno. It's a dialogue between Socrates and a guy named Meno. And in this particular spot in this dialogue, Meno is introducing what has been called the paradox of learning. So there's a paradox here where to learn something, it seems like you have to know what it is that you're trying to learn. But to do that, there are some strange tensions that appear. And Socrates is just restating to Meno what that paradox is. And so Socrates says in this dialogue, a person cannot search either for what he knows or for what he does not know. Now if we ask why would that be, well, he goes on, well, he can't search for what he knows because he knows it. So there's no reason to search. In other words, if you're trying to search for what you know, well, there's no need to search because you already know it. And so why would you search for it? But now on the other hand, he says he can't search for what he does not know because he doesn't know what to look for. So when it comes to learning, if you really don't know something, then how can you search for something that you don't know? And this is the paradox that Meno brings up and that Socrates restates in his work called the Meno. And what's interesting is that Plato takes this paradox and he makes an argument that really we never learn anything. Instead, whatever it is that we call learning is just recollection. We just recall what we once knew. And what this implies for Plato is that the soul exists, but also that the soul is eternal and unchanging. So it's eternal because we know that the body dies, and we know that the body also comes into being. So when we're born, we exist. When we die, we cease to exist, but that is the part of us that ceases to exist is the body. And so this recollection that Plato is talking about is recalling something that has existed in our soul that we've always known from as long as our soul has been around, which has been forever, arguably. And what happens at birth is that there's sort of a fall that exists in Plato where we have knowledge when we're just in our soul, but we forget everything that we knew in our soul because of the limitations of our human body. And so all of learning for Plato then is remembering what we've always known. This is his doctrine of recollection. All of learning is just recalling things that we knew in a past life, and so this can relate to ideas such as reincarnation. So the soul is always going on for forever, but the body is dying, coming back to life in a different situation, and the soul is getting connected to a different body. And for Plato, this is also why the questions of, say, Socrates can actually lead to insight. So again, if we think about the Socratic method, the way the Socratic method works when it comes to teaching is you ask students questions so that they can figure out what they know, or they can figure out the answers to the questions themselves. So the Socratic method, you're not telling people what to think or what to believe. You're getting them to think for themselves so they can figure it out on their own. Well, what would this mean for Plato? Well, what this means for Plato is that if you can ask people questions and they can develop insight, then that means that the insight already exists inside of them. Well, how can the insight already exist inside of them? Well, for Plato, it's because they're recalling something that they've always known, but they just forget, and all you need is to be questioned so that you can recall what you've always known. Socrates, at one point in Plato's dialogue, says that the task of a philosopher or a teacher is really just like the task of a midwife. So a midwife doesn't give birth to anyone. The midwife helps the mother give birth to a baby, and so a teacher is supposed to help the student give birth to knowledge. And what that means is that the knowledge is already in you, and the only task of a teacher is to help you realize what you've already known but have forgotten. So again, this suggests that the soul is immortal and eternal, and so we read in the Meno that if the truth about reality is always in our soul, then the soul would be immortal, so that you should always confidently try to seek out and recollect what you do not know at present. But also, this further suggests that the soul and the body are two separate things. So like his distinction between the forms and the particular, the forms are unchanging, the particulars are always changing. Well, you can think the same way about the soul and the body. So the soul is pure actualization. In other words, it's eternal, it's immortal, it's always going to be there, it's not going to go away. But of course, the body is always changing. People are born, people die, and so there's always changing. Our brains can change, our mental states can change, but the soul is always one thing. And this is actually another reason for Plato why we might argue that the death of Socrates is a good thing, because if the soul is what pure actualization is, and the body is always changing, well, to die in the body is just to be completely present with the soul and to be in a state where you have full access to the forms, and that would be a good thing. Plato also saw, because of this, that the vocation of the philosopher is really to prepare us for death, because in the body, the one thing that we know about the body is we're going to die, and so helping people to recall what it's like to be pure soul or pure actualization is the task of the philosopher. And furthermore, the things that we care about in this life are imperfect representations of the real things that we should care about. So if we're talking about triangles in the particular world, they're all imperfect, and the way to know what a true triangle is to reflect and gain access to the form of a triangle. Well, this is also true about everything else. So let's take beauty, for example. So we are, you might say, made to love beauty, according to Plato. Well, this love can grow in its depth or grow in its maturity. So at the basic level, we might love physical beauty. So this would be the beauty that exists in the particulars. In this symposium, actually, Socrates discusses how physical love or love for physical beauty can actually be the beginning of true wisdom if we allow our reflection to take us to what the source of beauty is. So particular beauty that we see around us are everything in the physical world, whatever it is that we're attracted to, is an imperfect representation of what beauty is. Now, if it's a beauty that you see in another person and you're attracted physically to another person, well, you have the beginning of love, and you have maybe the beginning of a mature love and the beginning of a mature wisdom. But if it just stays there, you're not going to have the depth of what you're made for. Because there's something beyond being attracted to physical beauty, and that is to be attracted to the soul of another person. And that's where you're growing in maturity when you think about love, when you're attracted to soul beauty, the soul of another person. Because remember, the person is divided into two parts. They have a soul, they have a body. If you're just attracted to the physical body, it's on the way to becoming wise, but it's not there yet. But if you're attracted to the person's soul, you're getting closer. But then if you go beyond that, and then you access the realm of the forms, and you become attracted to true beauty, then you've obtained true wisdom in your access and your reflection on the forms. Now, there is this question in Plato as to how do the particulars and the forms relate to one another. And the best that we have from Plato's writings is really a story that he tells, or a myth that he tells, to explain how the two are related. So again, if we're thinking about beauty, there's a form of beauty, a form of the good, and then we see particular examples of beauty in the real world. And we know that the particulars are beautiful because we can reflect on what true beauty is. Well, how did the world get to be that way? How did it get to be the case that there are particular examples of beautiful things in the world? Well, Plato tells this story about what he calls the demiurge, or a divine craftsman. Now, when I think about this story, the best way that I can understand what Plato is trying to say is by thinking about how my kids like to play with Play-Doh. So my kids have Play-Doh. I mean, it's ironic, Play-Doh and Play-Doh. But they like to play with Play-Doh, and they have these shapes that they make with these balls of Play-Doh. Now we can think of each of these shapes, whether it's the shape of a fish, a shape of a lion, a shape of an elephant, a shape of a triangle, whatever it is, we could think of those shapes as the forms. And then we can think of the Play-Doh itself as the material, the matter that exists out there in the real world. It has no shape to it. It has no form. But what the demiurge does, or what my kids when they're playing with Play-Doh do, so my kids would be kind of like the demiurge here, they take the Play-Doh and they push it through the form, and what comes out is an imperfect representation of what the actual form or the mold of a thing actually is. And so Plato tells a story in his Timaeus about how this happens, and so here you have the demiurge is responsible for pushing the particulars, the material things. And by the way, the material things are eternal for Plato, so the material, the world has always been here. And the forms are also eternal, they've always been here. But the way that the material world gets its substance, the way that you have particular examples of beauty, is because they've been pushed through by the demiurge through the forms. And that's the relationship between the particulars and the forms. Now, this brings up some interesting questions when it comes to ethics, the way that we think about the gods, and the way that we think about these concepts like, say, holiness or goodness. So there's a famous dilemma, another famous dilemma, called Euthyphro's dilemma, where in this dialogue, Euthyphro is asking a question to try to understand the nature of goodness, and the nature of justice. And he asks the question, is the holy loved by the gods because it is holy, or is it holy because it is loved by the gods? So you have to think about the dilemma here. So on the one hand, you have this idea of holiness, and if this idea of holiness exists out there, and the gods are just trying to do whatever it is that is holy, or they're just trying to love whatever it is that is holy, then it suggests that holiness exists independently of the gods, and that the gods are trying to live up to some holy standard. But of course, if you flip it around, and you say that the gods exist above holiness, and the gods are really deciding what is holy or not, then holiness can change depending on what the gods want it to be. Another way to think about this dilemma is to think about goodness. So is something good because the gods made it good, or do the gods simply recognize the good? So again, same dilemma, but what this suggests for Plato is that if it's the case that the gods are just making something good, then the gods are the standard of goodness. But of course, they could decide to make anything good. They could decide to make racism a good thing in one instance, and then in the next instance, they could decide to make racism a bad thing. And so Plato doesn't like the idea that the idea of goodness is just dependent upon the whims of the gods. And so what this suggests for him is that goodness must be a separate thing from the gods. And again, if you think back to his story of the demiurge, well, goodness would be like the forms or the mold that the Plato goes through, and the demiurge's responsibility is just to push the Plato through the forms, but the forms are different than the divine craftsman. And this makes us think back to the idea put forward by Protagoras, where Protagoras says that a human being is the measure of all things. Well, if you think about this in relationship to the gods, are the gods the measure of all things? Are human beings really the measure of all things? Well, what Plato would say is he would say that Protagoras is wrong. He's wrong in claiming that humans are the measure of all things, because goodness itself, these ideas, are just objective reality, and they're actually the measure of all things, and our job, therefore, is to access them and live up to those ideals. So, from this, Plato develops a goal in ethics, where what we're trying to do in ethics is we're trying to get our particular moral acts to become more like the perfect form of goodness. This is what we want to do. And the way that this happens is both by worship, or we might think of worship as reflecting. So we want to do deep reflection on the nature of forms. We want to love pure goodness. But it also happens by pursuing virtue in the real world. And this is where there's practice. So you have to practice to become virtuous. And this happens in the realm of particulars, where you start forming habits. And we'll see this more in the works of Aristotle. In his virtue approach of ethics, he really develops this idea. But we want to practice living a virtuous life so that we become virtuous people. And so we pursue goodness first, and then you will achieve true happiness by pursuing true goodness, loving the forms. That's actually how we achieve happiness, and it's never the other way around for Plato. Goodness can't just be what makes us happy. Rather, we pursue what's good, and then that will make us happy. Now, because of this, Plato has an interesting thought where he argues that people do not knowingly do evil. Because if loving goodness and pursuing goodness makes us happy, well then, why would we ever do anything other than pursue goodness? Why would we ever pursue evil? Well, Plato argues the reason why people pursue evil is because they're forgetting they're not reflecting on true goodness. They're forgetting true goodness. They don't know what true goodness is, and so they're darkened in their understanding. And because they're darkened in their understanding, they start to pursue evil. But it's all a lack of knowledge. Ignorance is really our problem, and ignorance happens when we allow our passions in life to darken our reason. Now, this gets into more into his idea of what a soul is. So if Plato divides the human person between a body and a soul, well, the soul is actually divided into three parts for Plato. So we have our reason, we have our spirit, which for Plato is like a will, and we have our appetite, which we consider in this case would be the desires of the body. Now, the good life for Plato is the rational life, to live a life according to reason. This is where we access the forms, where we remember and recollect what true goodness is, what true beauty is. And so with our reason, we can become aware of a goal or a value. With our spirit, this is kind of neutral for Plato. It can be moved one way or the other, but this is what drives us toward action in the real life. And then the appetite we could think of as our desires, our emotions, and this is also trying to control our spirit and our will. And there's oftentimes a battle between what we think is rationally right and what we feel is right. So an example that I like to give would be the example of, it could be, say, working out. It could be studying for an exam. Anything that we do in life where we have to be disciplined to achieve some goal in life. Well, for Plato, when you think about those types of examples, you set a goal with your reason. So if I want to get to the gym 3 times every single week and work out hard, I might set a goal for what I want to achieve during my workout, and that's a rational thing that we do. We're trying to achieve some rational end. And so we set up a plan, we put the plan on paper, we have a schedule for when I'm going to do this, and let's say I'm going to work out at 6 in the morning. Well, then what happens is my alarm clock will go off at 5:30 a.m., and instantly this other part of my soul, this appetite, creeps in, the desires of my body creep in, and they'll start to say, you want to sleep in a little longer. And now there's a battle between my appetite, my desires, and my reason. And the goal of the ethical life for Plato is to conquer your appetites with reason. So you know what's rationally the right thing to do. So you conquer the appetite so that your will can be driven towards a rational end. This is what it means to live the ethical life for Plato. And this is, by the way, how virtue happens. So you do this enough times, eventually your appetites start to change and you start to want to do the rational thing, but it can be a battle, a struggle to try to do that. Now that ethical way of thinking about individual ethics relates to Plato's political philosophy. So if we're going to create a just society, Plato reasons that we need to have just rulers. And you can find all of this either in the Republic or in his Statesmen. But if we want to have just rulers, then what we need for Plato would be rulers who have expertise in justice. That only seems reasonable for Plato. Now he thinks about this idea of expertise in other fields, and he says it should be no different than when we're talking about, say, government. So if you think about the field of medicine, well, we expect that medical doctors will have a particular type of expertise in medicine so that they can do their job well. Farmers will obviously have a different type of expertise, and if they don't have that expertise, they shouldn't be a farmer. And so we have these expectations when it comes to many different fields, many different types of work, where to do that work well, you need to have a certain type of expertise. And so he asked the question, what type of expertise should a statesman or a ruler have? He thinks through the types of expertise that a statesman should have. And he says there's really three types of expertise that a statesman needs to have. So, for one, a statesman needs to have expertise in what he calls theoretical science. Now, in theoretical science, he makes this division between mental work, or work that involves ideas, versus physical work. So, again, you see this relationship between his realm of the forms and his realm of the particulars. To do mental work is to use your soul to access the realm of the forms, and so to do deep reflection, deep thinking, whereas physical work is to do most of your work with the particulars here in the world that we see around us. And so what type of expertise does a statesman have? Well, the statesman needs to be able to do mental work, theoretical work. That's what a statesman's all about. But then he continues to explain the work a little bit further, saying that the statesman also needs to have expertise in what he calls directive science. And here he makes a distinction between what we might call a practitioner of truth versus a spectator of truth. So a spectator of truth is someone who can, say, do the work of a pure philosopher, where the spectator just thinks about great ideas, thinks about justice, thinks about beauty, thinks about goodness, and can recognize and spectate what those ideas are, but doesn't necessarily do anything with it. A practitioner of truth, on the other hand, is the person that can reflect on those ideas and then figure out how to put those ideas into practice in the real world. And so a statesman needs to be able to practice knowledge, not just think deeply about justice, but be able to practice justice. And then the third type of expertise that a statesman needs is what he calls pre-directive science. And now here he makes a distinction between a producer salesman versus a retailer. So a retailer is someone that buys other people's products and then sells those products in his or her store. Whereas a producer salesman is somebody that creates their own products and then sells those products in the store. And so when we're thinking about the expertise of a statesman, so it's somebody that deals with the realm of ideas, who can practice those ideas, so is very practical with the ideas that they're reflecting upon, but also is selling their own ideas and not just taking somebody else's ideas and selling them. So this is what makes it a pre-directive science. And so for Plato, the discipline of political philosophy really goes back to Plato. According to Plato, it's a theoretical, directive, and pre-directive science that seeks to shepherd a human society. And so this is the goal, the type of expertise that we need to have for somebody who is going to govern society. Now, Plato moves on from here to consider what type of structure needs to be set up to have a just society. And he thinks through his options this way. So if we go back to the idea of reason versus appetite in the human person, well, when it comes to running a society could be ran according to reason, or for Plato it would be according to laws, just laws, or they can be run according to the appetite or to the desires of the people, whoever the people might be. And so for Plato, obviously, you want a society that's run according to reason, according to laws. This would be the idea of a just society, is a society ran according to reason, reason that connects with the forms of what a just society ought to be. And then you can break it down into how you would achieve a society that is run according to reason. Well, here Plato considers a society that's ruled by one person. Well, a society that's ruled by one person is a monarch, and it's a monarch when that one person, that king, is ruling according to law, according to reason. That's a just society for Plato. It would be an unjust society if that king is ruling according to desire. That's what's called tyranny. That's a bad thing. And so, for Plato, we want to always be ruling according to reason, not to appetite. Well, obviously, you could also have a society that's ruled by the few. If the few are ruling according to reason, that's an aristocracy. But if they're ruling according to just what they want, well, that's an oligarchy, and that's bad. But of course, you can have a society that's ruled by the many, the masses. This is called democracy. But when democracy is being ruled by uh, the desires and the appetites of the masses, well, that's bad. That's called anarchy. Now, if we go back to the last lecture, you remember that Plato's teacher was Socrates, and in Athens, Socrates was killed. Socrates was killed under a democratic government, and so I think this very much influences Plato here at this point. Plato does not like democracy at all. In fact, Plato thinks democracy is the worst form of government. He despises democracy. But I think Plato also has some reasons for this other than just his personal experience. For Plato, if you want to have a just society, the reason why democracy can't work structurally for him is because in a democracy, if you want people to rule according to reason, then you have to overcome some huge obstacles. First, you have to overcome the obstacle of ignorance. So if the masses are going to govern themselves, they have to be educated. And they have to have the expertise needed to be a statesman. So you have to spend time educating the society on the expertise that is required for being a statesman. But this is a problem because if you were to do that, well, for society to flourish, you also need to have people in society that have different types of expertise. And this actually might be where democracy is impractical for Plato, because in a society where everyone has the expertise of a statesman, when are they going to have the time to develop an expertise for farming? Or when are they going to be able to develop the expertise for medicine or for plumbing or for whatever else that you need to have in a society to make that society run well? So democracy structurally is impractical. Not only does he despise it, but it's just impractical. You can't create a situation where the masses all have expertise in governing a society, and so it will naturally lead to anarchy, where people are just ruling according to their desire. And when that happens, they will end up putting to death somebody like Socrates. And so Plato's solution to this is to not have a democratic government, but rather to have a society where you have either one person ruling, so a philosopher king, or a few people who are doing the work of a statesman according to the expertise that is required for a statesman. So Plato doesn't like democracy. He thinks that tyranny will naturally arise out of any democratic society because democracy assumes that everyone is qualified to rule, but that can't possibly be the case because not everyone has the expertise of a statesman. And so that gives you just a very basic idea of Plato's political philosophy, and hopefully these two lectures have given you an overview of Plato's thought.